Hello, Christian ethics class, and welcome to this next class on what we're calling good life, or wealth, poverty, and the economy. I find this topic really interesting and in many ways difficult, both as a theologian and a teacher, and as kind of an American Christian, and also as a lawyer. As a lawyer, I deal with issues. My specialties really are intellectual property, patents, copyrights, trademarks, privacy, data privacy, computer crime. All of these are areas of law that deal very much with economics. In fact, a lot of my legal scholarship is law and economics scholarship, and we use tools of classical economic analysis and behavioral economics and game theory to look at the way different rules of law work, and it can be a very useful way to think about and to analyze the law. But a lot of Anglo-American law really is rooted in certain views about economics, which in many ways our Constitution reflects, and views about property and ownership. And these are important, and in some ways, potentially sometimes, can conflict with, or at least raise questions in relation to how we might, as Christians living in a society and as theologians thinking theologically through what ethics means in these areas, can raise some interesting tensions. So in this lecture, I want to focus on really three broad themes, and we're going to focus on the question of work, we're going to focus on the question of property, and we're going to focus on the question of banking, money, economy, society. And I think you'll see there's a logic to the fact that our first kind of substantive dive into specific issues last week was the question of church and state, because how you think about society and what a good society is, and how the state relates to the church, and how all that relates to kind of the final eschatological reckoning and the goal of society, is directly going to impact how you think about these economic issues. So you can't tease these things apart and treat them totally separate. It's really a package, and as we talked about in really one of the first lectures, different kind of webs on the node, or nodes on the web, of how we think about things. So let's take this first broad theme of the question of work, and a few questions that we want to ask about work. Is work a created good? Or is work really just a burden or a curse or a result of sin? And then if work is in some way a created good, what kinds of work are good? What kinds of work are not so good? If we can make that sort of distinction, what does it mean to do good work? And then, how should work be managed? Should work be managed by a professional class of managers? And if there is some kind of professional class of managers, how should labor be treated? What kind of rights, if any, should labor have? So let's just talk for a moment about this first bullet, and we can think about it using these frames or buckets that our text has given us of universal, subversive, and ecclesial ethics, and you'll find a lot of that information in the text itself. Generally, from the perspective of universal ethics, we probably would say that, yes, there is an aspect of work that is a created good, that is part of the natural created order. When we look at the story of the Garden of Eden, and again, we can kind of set aside whatever scientific issues we might have with that for now. Take my theology and science class, we'll talk about some of those. But as a narrative in Scripture, it's giving us at least a theological account of nature and work and what is right. And we see from the very beginning that the man and the woman are given the task of tending the garden, and of being responsible for the animals and for the rest of the created order. So there's often in universal ethics that's seen as an implication that work originally is part of the created order. It's natural, it's good. People ought to do productive work. Now, of course, the universal side will recognize the doctrine of the fall and the fact that work is tainted and cursed and made difficult and made perhaps harsh, the thorns and the thistles and so on that the garden begins to produce in that narrative indicates that there are aspects of work that are not good, that are part of fallenness. And so part of our theology of work then from a universal perspective might be to try and understand what about the work that we do is part of our created nature. What about the way our work is constructed and put together reflects sinfulness or fallenness, and how can we begin to structure work and do work and think about work that gets back more toward the ideal of what work is supposed to be. So that's one way of thinking about it. From a subversive perspective, of course, there's going to be a lot of attention paid to the power dynamics in the way that we do work. Now, the subversive perspective isn't necessarily going to reject the universal perspective that work is part of a created good. In fact, I think many liberation theologians, for example, will talk about the dignity of work and the fact that there is an inherent dignity in work, but will emphasize the fact that the way the world is currently structured, a few wealthy, powerful elites are able to dominate the rest of the populace, and particularly disadvantaged populations, and cause their work to be particularly harsh, even close to being a form of slavery, if not literally being a form of slavery. So that will be a kind of analysis of work that will often be done from the subversive perspective. From the ecclesial perspective, perhaps the emphasis will be on, as you might expect, what's the relationship of our vocation, our calling, as laborers in whatever kind of labor we have, to the life of the church first, and then how does that relate to our life in the rest of society? Now, an interesting tension here, I think, and we've talked about this a little when we talked about the relationship between church and state, is kind of the inheritance of early and really medieval Christendom about work. And we mentioned that, certainly in the medieval period, there comes to be, broadly speaking, this notion that, there are those who work, there are those who fight, and there are those who pray. The people who work are the peasants working the farms and trades. The people who fight are the nobles, the knights, and so on. The people who pray are the priests, the monks, the bishops. And we mentioned that there came to be this sense that the people who pray really have a higher spiritual estate than the people who work. And we saw, looking at Martin Luther's letter to the German nobility, how that became a really significant tension during the period of the Reformation, and how the reformers, Luther in particular, Calvin as well, tried to create theologies of vocation and work that kind of got past that difference. So one of the challenges for ecclesial ethics today is to try and kind of incorporate that and to see how all kinds of work relates to our life in the church. So that will be, a very general, broad sense of how those different perspectives will think about work. In terms of management, again, very different perspectives. From a universal ethic, there can be a sense in which certain kinds of universal ethics recognize that there's some kind of propriety in having certain people who have the calling or vocation to be managers, to be bosses, to be employers, in the language of the New Testament, right, to be masters, and who else, some people might have the vocation, at least at certain points in their life, to be employees, laborers, workers, and will then focus on the kind of values that a worker ought to have in trying to do good work and relating to the boss, and how the boss ought to respect and dignify the worker. So we can think of it that way. From the subversive perspective, very often the question of the division between management and labor is going to be subject to some severe criticism. And in fact, as we'll see in a moment, from some aspects of the subversive perspective, might even suggest that the distinction between management and labor, or between owners and workers, is one of the major theological ethical problems we face. From the ecclesial perspective, perhaps the way to think about it is to think about what our relationships to each other are and ought to be within the church, and then how those relationships to each other within the church ought to spill out and influence the way that we do work in the world. And very often, one of the things that'll be emphasized here is the kind of leveling within the church, the fact that class distinctions, race distinctions, gender distinctions in the New Testament, in the Gospels, in the letters of Paul, really begin to be, in many ways, leveled down, and how that flows into the way we think about and the way we do our work. You might see, and I maybe would suggest, that between the universal and subversive and ecclesial perspectives on the general idea of work, the distinctions are a little bit more subtle. It's, I think, maybe a little bit more of a matter of emphasis. Who are we emphasizing? Whose plight, whose status are we emphasizing? All of those perspectives, I think, see a value in work and see a value in the sense of vocation, but it's a difference in emphasis. With the question of property, I think the differences become a bit more distinct. I think they become quite a bit more distinct. So in the question of property, here are some of the questions we might ask. Should individuals own private property? Is private property a natural right? Private property ownership a natural right? Is private property even a valid theological category? And then, if property ownership is a valid category, what limits, if any, should be placed on property ownership? Should the church have a role in limiting or redistributing property ownership? Should the state have a role in limiting or redistributing property ownership? Now, you should notice that these questions tie directly to the broad questions of justice that we were asking in our lecture on church and state. Remember that there are a number of different forms of justice, and one of those forms of justice is distributive justice. And that asks this question of how should scarce resources be distributed. Now, I mentioned just there, how should scarce resources be distributed? So classical economic theory, modern economic theory, thinks of resources as scarce. I have here my copy of our textbook. This is my copy. It's one individual copy. This resource in and of itself is scarce. There's only so many copies of this book available. If I destroy this book, it's gone, right? It's used up. If I give it to you, you have it, and I don't. Now, I can go buy another copy, right? But then I have to spend some other resources, some of my money, to buy another copy. The supply isn't infinite. If the supply is not infinite, then there's going to be some level of demand, right? And here we have the laws of supply and demand, and it's going to be worth a certain amount of money. That's, in many ways, a metaphysical claim, and in many ways, a theological claim. So, of course, when you look at something like an individual copy of a textbook, and a printer has so many copies and so much ink and so much paper, we can kind of easily see that as a discrete thing, this can be scarce. But overall, is there scarcity? Do we live in a condition of scarcity, or do we live in a condition of abundance? So that will be a distinction. Some who emphasize a strong sense of rights and private property will say that in the current state in which we live, whether it's just looking at nature or whether it's looking through a theological lens at the doctrine of the fall, it's characterized by at least some degree of scarcity. Resources are not limitless. Others, from other perspectives, might say, but the doctrine of creation tells us that we live in a condition of abundance, that God has supplied and will supply everything that we need to survive. The question isn't whether we have enough to survive and even to thrive. The question is, are some people taking far more than they need and thereby leaving others with not enough? Those are interesting theological questions that we can think about. Okay, so on this question of private property rights, universal ethics tends to suggest that there is some kind of natural right to hold private property, or at least some kind of practical right that allows for private property ownership within kind of the current age in which we live. And a great example of this is one of our key figures in universal ethics, which is Thomas Aquinas. So Aquinas suggests that, whether or not there was natural property in the Garden of Eden, we're not in Eden anymore, and to effectively be able to allocate and divide resources, there is some degree of scarcity, so having some rights in private property makes sense. In the modern Enlightenment context, we can look at a figure like John Locke, who very much informs, I think, a lot of aspects of modern Anglo-American property law, which says that people have a natural right to own property because in the state of nature, property is undeveloped. But once a human being adds labor to that property, does something productive with it, they've added something to it, like you've planted a garden that didn't exist before, then you have a natural right to that. So that's a universal way to think about private property rights. From a subversive perspective, there's going to be a lot of skepticism and criticism about private property rights, or at least about the scope of private property rights. And there's going to be very often kind of a historical critique of the way private property rights have been owned and the way private property rights have been used, again, by kind of the wealthy elite interests in society to accumulate far more than they need and to exclude others from what they basically need to get by. So from the universal perspective, there are going to be questions about allocation and distribution, but as we'll see in a moment, very often many of those questions are going to be left to how markets, how private transactions will allocate and distribute, perhaps with something left over, a role left over for church or for state to provide a safety net. From a subversive perspective, there's going to be a much stronger sense very often that the state and or the church ought to have a more direct role in redistributing claimed private property rights and in equalizing the playing field. I think this question of property ownership from the ecclesial perspective is a really interesting one, and at least for me, I think it's a place that it really puts some tension on ecclesial ethics. And the text mentions this a little bit and talks about, ecclesial ethicists will often first say, well, let's not look at the way these things ought to work in the broader society first. Let's ask first, what kind of community ought the church to be? And if we look at the kind of community throughout Scripture that God's people are supposed to be, and then in particular in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, in the epistles, in the Gospels, how the church is supposed to be, certainly within and among each other, we're supposed to be free with our goods. We're supposed to provide for each other if we really love each other. We ought not to have people within our own communities who are in serious lack because we can provide for them. And all of that is, of course, strongly biblical and true and good. The question is, how does that translate to any kind of broader ethic? And maybe it doesn't. Some ecclesial ethicists will say, in a sense, it doesn't because, let's just be the example that we can be as the church. My question back would very often be, but the kind of distribution of goods within the church still presumes some idea, some philosophical idea about property rights and ownership, and also presumes some kind of legal idea. Because even within the church, if I'm going to say, I own this and I will give it to you out of charity, I'm still saying I own this. I have a legal right. I have some kind of moral right. So in a sense, I think it begs the question. But I think it's one of those very interesting questions where these different schools of thought, again, kind of bump up against each other, and maybe even in some ways blend together to think it through. Another key piece of property, which we're going to talk about toward the end of the semester, is how does property ownership relate to care for creation? I'm not going to spend really much time talking about this point in this lecture because we're going to have 2 whole classes on this. But I just want to highlight it now because, again, we're talking about resource use and resource allocation. I mentioned before, I'm holding my book. I can, legally and under American law, I can do what I would like with this book. I can't make a copy of it. That'd be a copyright violation, but I can discard it. I can throw it away. I can sell it to somebody else. I can waste it if I want to. And, on a very small scale, that would be a waste, but it, wouldn't be a sort of terrible global tragedy. But when you do have resources that can be used up, we call those in economic terms rivalrous resources. And when you think about things like the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, to a certain extent, certainly on a local level, those are rivalrous resources. There's only so much clean air, only so much clean water, and so on in the environment that we inhabit. Even though the globe is huge, there's a lot of people in the world, right? So the question of who owns a piece of land and can you just pollute it if you want to, and how does that affect other people, right? All those questions will relate to both property ownership and care for creation, and we'll talk about that in detail toward the end of the semester. The last broad area that I want to introduce in this lecture is money, banking, and the economy. And I think you'll see how these themes relate to the theme of property ownership and relate to the theme of work. If work is sort of maybe the micro question, really for a lot for the individual, and property ownership is an individual and a somewhat broader question, money, banking, and the economy is kind of the big meta question. You might say it's kind of like microeconomics and macroeconomics. So here are a few questions. Should lending at interest or usury be permitted? Now, this seems like an odd question, I think, probably for most of us in this class, because we take for granted that in the modern society there is lending for interest, and we probably don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. We have banks that will give us, a mortgage. I'm sitting in my home right now recording this lecture. I have a mortgage. There's no way I could have bought this home without a mortgage. We use credit cards. We, may rightly be cautious about using credit cards, but we might think there are appropriate uses of credit cards, and that's taking money at interest. We take student loans. Again, we may rightly want to be cautious about taking too much student loans, but we do it. I've done it, of course. I've, several graduate degrees. I've financed that education. I couldn't have done it at the cost at which it is without taking money at interest. So we take it for granted, but we forget that in the Hebrew scriptures, usury was condemned. And, the community found ways to lend money at interest, but to do it, they had to come up with some sophisticated arguments to deal with the condemnations of usury. In the early church, the early Christian church, usury was universally condemned. And there are, enormous tensions in medieval society and then into the Renaissance because of that ecclesial condemnation, because as the economies of various cities and territories became bigger, as there was more trade across borders, and as trade got bigger, and also particularly as wars had to be financed, There were just circumstances in which there was not enough capital immediately available in any one source, and people had to go, rulers, leaders, so on and so on, had to go to others to get that money. And there were tensions about how that money could be provided. The church was extraordinarily wealthy and had money that it could provide. There were tensions with people outside the church, in particular with the Jewish community, who very often played roles in financing, and some of the roots or background of anti-Semitism from the early Christian era through the medieval times, even up till today, the modern era, has to do with those kinds of tensions. So that was a big issue. So the church really had to try to work it out into the Renaissance, and in particularly through the Reformation. It's really in the Reformation era, and in particular in some of Calvin's writings, that we begin to see theological justifications for lending at interest that wouldn't be called usury. So what we say today very often, at least from a universal perspective, is that it's not lending at interest that's per se wrong. It's lending at excessive or exorbitant rates of interest that is usury. But that's a real shift. So we want to have that as a bit of a background. And it leads into really this second bullet, which is who should control the means of production? How should such control be allocated? This is one of the big meta questions. You see that term means of production, you ought to automatically think, here comes the debate about capitalism, socialism, and communism. And that's absolutely right. This is the big question. So, broadly speaking, very simplified, broadly speaking, the capitalist perspective, the modern capitalist perspective, which is the perspective of most developed economies in the world, broadly speaking, certainly the North American United States perspective, I think fair to say the UK perspective, I still think fair to say the European Union perspective. You'll hear talk about European-style socialism. I don't think that's quite a fair characterization, because really the pillars of the European common market are the free movement of labor, goods, and capital. Now, so what capitalism, broadly speaking, says is that the means of production, the capital, the money, the material of producing goods and services, in the modern era, the intellectual property, patents, copyrights, things like that, are privately owned. They're owned by individuals. They're owned by corporate entities that have the legal status of individuals under the law. They're not owned by the government. They're not collectively owned by the workers. They're owned by private entities. And they're distributed, they're allocated primarily by markets. Again, let's take our book for this course. There's a physical book here. There's paper, things like that. The printers of this book had to buy that from somewhere, and that paper was privately owned, probably by a corporation, bought by the corporation that Blackwell that produced this book. More significantly for a resource like this, there's this text, these ideas that are expressed in a certain way. That's intellectual property. It's protected by copyright. So initially, the authors of our text, Sam Wells and Ben Quash, would have the intellectual property, the copyright in that work. And then they will have an agreement with Blackwell, the publisher, that allocates that right, that either gives it to Blackwell or licenses it to Blackwell. And then you and I, buying this text book, we have rights to this physical book. We have a right to use it, to read it. The copyright limits our rights. We can't make large-scale reproductions of it. We can resell our physical copy of the book, but we can't make a scan of the whole book and then sell the scan. All of that are ways that the market allocates the means of production and allocates the resources produced with the means of production. The market sets a price, and you pay the price. Communism, broadly speaking, would suggest that the means of production are communally owned by the workers and are distributed by need. So there's a vision or an idea of society that the people doing the labor, the laborers, remember that question about work and the relationship between management and labor. That's where that connects to this question. It's the laborers who really have the right of ownership, and they have it collectively, not really individually. And then resources get allocated not primarily by markets, but primarily by need. You've heard that slogan, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. And that's that idea in communism. And then in socialism, again, very broadly speaking, the idea is that the resources are, the means of production are centrally owned and distributed by deed. So centrally owned, the idea here is that the society, the state, really initially has the ownership of the means of production, at least of the central aspects of the means of production. You might say of the infrastructure resources that allow things to be produced. And then notice the distribution under socialism isn't purely by need. It's not quite like communism. But the idea is that as you are making a contribution to the collective whole, you receive something back for that contribution. It's not, however, merely a distribution by market, where the invisible hand of the market says, all right, look, you're willing to pay, $100 for this book, it's $100. If you're not willing to pay $100 and no one will buy it at that price, the price will come down, something like that. But the idea is that there's some kind of central planning, some kind of central authority or centralized way of saying this sort of contribution results in this sort of reward. Now, all three of these perspectives, of course, are famously and widely set off against each other today. Certainly, through the Cold War period and to some extent even today when we're dealing with countries like China or North Korea, communism is still a big issue. But, as we've seen in the current election season, from the Bernie Sanders campaign, this question of socialism, and Sanders even kind of willing to call himself in some respects a socialist, this argument about capitalism versus socialism, arguments about to what extent is our current, even American economy becoming more socialist with things like centralized healthcare? To what extent is the European economy really socialist? Again, with things like healthcare and other major infrastructure aspects of the economy. And, even I think most people who call themselves capitalists today in North America are not sort of pure, unfettered free market capitalists, but will have a somewhat more subtle theory about distribution by markets and the sense that the places in which markets may fail and in which governments may then have an important role in correcting those failures, right? So there are kind of some degrees of overlap. Now, in terms of our ethical perspectives, a universal ethical perspective is going to focus on these sort of universal principles, and I think at least in modern ethics, now I think in historic ethics, right, the universal principle was prohibiting usury, lending at interest. Without lending at interest, you cannot have modern capitalism. So the universal perspective historically would not have been friendly to modern capitalism. But I think it's fair to say that today, many Christian ethicists who are in the universal camp are going to defend some form of market-type system. Or at least I should say that many Christian thinkers and ethicists today who will defend some kind of free market system will see themselves as operating within some kind of universal framework, particularly a framework that stresses natural rights in individual ownership of property, right? So see how the perspective on work and on individual ownership of property ties into particular views about markets and capitalism. I don't know that you have too many Christian ethicists who are kind of literally stressing communism today. I think there are some strands of liberation theology that are directly tied to Marxism and to Marxist thinking. And of course, Karl Marx is the father of modern capitalism, modern communism, and or at least a form of modern communism. You know, people who are serious Marxists will say that Russian Soviet communism, Chinese communism, North Korean communism are not what Marx had in mind, and in fact, they'll probably more likely identify themselves as socialists. But liberation theology directly draws on those themes about workers, about communal ownership, about need. So that would be a subversive perspective. Ecclesial perspectives I don't think necessarily fit in one camp or another, but there are some important ecclesial ethicists working today who would call themselves socialists, or they might say Christian socialists. Now, I think that title of Christian socialist is a little bit confusing. It's always been a little bit confusing to me because there are political parties, particularly in some European countries, who are called the Christian socialists, and I don't think those parties necessarily resonate with the thinkers that I'm talking about. But as an example, again, let me give you one of the people that I've studied with, who examined my doctoral work, John Milbank. Milbank expressly calls himself a Christian socialist. He's written quite a bit on political theory and economics. And if you read his work, it's sort of subtle. I mean, what he's sort of focusing on is a somewhat idealized and romanticized, I think, view of kind of a medieval village in which there are trade guilds. There are people who are real good at working leather or something like that, right? There are people who are real good at brewing beer. There are people who are real good at building houses, and these people work together and they train apprentices. And in the trade guild system, there's a kind of central planning and ownership. It's not a dictatorship kind of central planning and ownership, but it's these trade associations that have a lot of sort of control about who enters the profession and what the standards are and so on, and then who give those goods to the rest of the society, or at least make them available and trade in goods. And Milbank also has a very central role. And if you kind of imagine that idealized medieval village, the center of the village is the local church, the local parish. And so where people go for support, where people go when they're, not able to make ends meet, when they're truly have a disaster in the family or something like that, they go to the church, the local parish, and they receive support there until they're able to be brought back into these other aspects. These other aspects of society, the trade guilds and so on, are connected to the church. They're not totally secular. They're not disconnected to the church. They all have their own kind of place and representation and festivals and feasts and so on in the local church. I think in many ways a really interesting and compelling vision. Whether it's a vision that can have any purchase in the world we live in right now is another question, and that will relate to your view of eschatology and how you view the fall and how that affects the rest of society and what the role of church is in relation to the state. So, these broad brush characterizations, are going to leave out some important details and some important nuances, but I think they're generally fair. I think they provide us with a kind of framework for our discussion. So, read the primary sources that we have for this week. And when we meet together on Thursday, we're going to talk about some of these big issues in relation to some of the debates that we're seeing right now in our presidential election, in some of the popular movements that we've seen in society today. Occupy Wall Street a number of years ago, Black Lives Matter today, all tie into some of these important themes. and we can talk about what our ethical perspectives are on those things. So this is the end of the lecture, and I'll see you on Thursday.